Welcome back to Movies Outpost. Today, we'll be diving into an action thriller movie titled Damaged, and as always, enjoy the recap. After leaving Edinburgh's Central Synagogue one night, Abigail Myers is attacked in her house by a mysterious hooded person. Unable to defend herself from the sudden assault, Abigail eventually meets her end. Later, in Chicago, Detective Dan Lawson examines a corpse, and his expertise lets him conclude that the scene was staged to send a message. Lawson seems to be haunted by ghosts of his past as he repeatedly listens to a voicemail from Sarah before being interrupted. He is then shown a few crime scene photographs from Scotland. Intrigued by the similarities of the case to one he previously handled in Chicago 6 years ago, Lawson joins the Scottish police in Edinburgh to assist Superintendent Kessler and DCI Glenn Boyd. He is then briefed about the violent way Abigail's limbs were severed and arranged in the formation of a cross. On their way to Abigail's place, Lawson learns that Boyd lost his young son a year ago who would have turned 3 that day. On location while outlining the crime scene for Lawson, Boyd also mentions that they found a key that strangely doesn't fit any of the locks in the house. Speaking to his wife, Marie, on the phone about getting home for dinner, Boyd spots Avery Thompson, Abigail's neighbor from across the street. Avery is the only person of interest in the case, as multiple neighbors reported witnessing an argument between him and Abigail. Boyd attempts to speak to him about Abigail and the case but is refused entry without a warrant. While leaving, Boyd notices another neighbor, Ms. Walsh, and goes over to meet her. They soon see Avery leaving his house in a rush, and Ms. Walsh reveals that he had accused Abigail of throwing an egg at his car, while an emotional Marie waits for her husband to return home and spend some time with her on this difficult day. Boyd is back at the office reporting to Kessler that they still do not seem to have a strong lead. Because of several dissimilarities, Lawson adds that he isn't completely sure if their cases are related either. Later that evening, Boyd gets home, but his grief forces him to stay in the car. Meanwhile, Lawson places a call to a fellow detective who used to be his partner in Chicago, Walker Bravo, only to reach his voicemail. A few drinks later, he is haunted by his memories of Sarah while a young woman named Grace is attacked by the hooded stranger in pretty much the same way as Abigail. Unknown to any of this, Boyd picks Lawson up to head over to Abigail's place to check something on a hunch. On the way, Lawson informs him that since Walker now lives in London, they can discuss the case with him. Getting personal then, he asks how Boyd is handling life without his son. A helpless Boyd tells him that while he turned to work as a distraction from his pain, Marie's grief led her to not be loyal with him. Reaching Abigail's street, Lawson spots Avery attempting to escape and gets Boyd to chase him through the back alley. Ambushing him ahead, the pair manages to block Avery as Boyd asks him about Abigail, offering his alibi. Avery mentions being fined by a speed camera around the time Abigail was attacked, when he adds that his argument with Abigail was simply about her job as a dog minder getting in the way of his peace. Boyd lets him leave before finally heading home himself. The next morning, Marie suggests inviting Lawson over for dinner. Just then, Boyd receives news of Grace's attack and rushes over to find severed limbs arranged in a cross, yet again. Lawson joins him soon after, and spotting a partial bloodied footprint leads him to realize that they were being baited. Under UV light, they spot the symbol of the Ankh, the Egyptian key to the gates of eternal life. Believing that they would find something similar at Abigail's place as well, Boyd suggests heading over. However, they end up finding a hint in a text marked specifically with the case number that Lawson was in charge of in Chicago. Alternatively, reciting the relevant verse in the text, Lawson hints at the culprit's views of anyone but his religious belief as ravenous wolves that everyone should be wary of. Speaking to Grace's mother later, Boyd learns of an old friend named Colin McGregor. While Lawson makes plans to meet Walker, Boyd informs Kessler that the mysterious key has no clues to follow. When she tells him about having confirmed Avery's alibi, Boyd is left with just Colin as a possible lead, who interestingly has a firearm license. Later that evening, Lawson meets Walker, who now designs alarm systems for a living. When Lawson mentions endlessly thinking of Sarah lately, Walker finally looks through the case files of Abigail and Grace while asking how he could help. The next morning, Boyd tracks down Colin McGregor only to be dismissed in the absence of a lawyer. During a formal investigation later, Colin provides an alibi, placing him in the warehouse of the security firm he works for in Manchester. Kessler and Lawson observe the conversation as it turns towards Colin's relationship with Grace. Strangely, Colin simply says that Grace was a lost soul. Later that evening, Kessler, Lawson, and Boyd are joined by Walker as they look more deeply into Colin's past association with a cult organization. They even discuss the symbolisms of the cross and the Ankh used to possibly imply that the culprit wholeheartedly believes that they were releasing victims from their present lives for their own good. When the discussion turns to how the culprit of the Chicago cases kept a jewelry souvenir for himself from each of his victims, it is revealed that Sarah was one of the victims of the case. Meanwhile, Colin observes Marie from afar while she is alone at home. At the Kildalton church the next day, Boyd learns of Colin's recent dismissal because of his inability to adhere to their beliefs. When he asks if Colin is capable of ending someone's life, Boyd is simply told to leave. Later that evening, Lawson and Walker join Marie and Boyd for dinner. While it seems like everyone is enjoying each other's company, Lawson notices Walker being way too comfortable with Marie, which gets him to talk about correctly handling grief. This infuriates Marie, and she tries to justify herself by saying that a person's reactions cannot be judged if they do not have hold of their sanity anymore. This leads to an uncomfortable but much-needed conversation between the couple later that night, after which they decide to understand each other's grief better. The next morning, a blissful Marie promises a trip to Italy after Boyd's current case is done. At work later that day, Boyd and the team learn that Colin's alibi of being in Manchester is valid, but Kessler is unwilling to completely write him off, as there is still the possibility of him having traveled all the way to Edinburgh. Abigail's neighbor, Ms. Walsh, visits Boyd that day to inform him about having noticed a strange man across the street a couple of days before the attack. When presented with a few photographs of suspects, she recognizes the guy she saw as Colin. With enough evidence to bring Colin in for questioning now, Kessler and Boyd ready a unit to ambush him even as he prepares to make his next attack. When he notices the cops, however, he makes a run for it. With the guidance of a drone, Boyd chases him and eventually manages to grab him and get him in for questioning. However, in the absence of a lawyer, Kessler decides to hold Colin overnight. Boyd reaches home that night and grows worried when he doesn't find Marie. Following the sound of her ringing phone to the attic, Boyd is shocked beyond measure when he sees that his wife has become the next victim. Walker meets a grief-stricken Boyd the next morning and urges him not to give up on the case. When Kessler informs Boyd about finding Marie's torso abandoned in the local park, he immediately heads over, as this would be the first time in this case that a victim's torso was found. Multiple police officers on location try to stop Boyd from getting too close, but he sees it anyway. Walker pulls him back in an attempt to calm him down, but Boyd's need for vengeance is already undeniable. Meanwhile, Colin's interrogation is underway, with Kessler pointing out the similarities between the arrangement of the victim's limbs. When asked if he had been to America, Colin answers that he has indeed visited several times. He adds that he had once even met a foreigner in London, and learned about an unsolved case similar to the one on hand, which intrigues Lawson, who is listening in. Boyd barges in just then, and is held back by Kessler. Lawson gets Boyd to leave and proceeds to join the interrogation himself, ending at Colin's apparent purpose in life being guiding lost souls to a brighter tomorrow. Lawson asks if he is actually a wolf disguised as a sheep. Without grounds to keep him any longer, Colin is soon allowed to leave, which infuriates Boyd. Meeting Lawson later, he insists that he needs to stay on the case to see Colin get punished like he deserves. A wise Lawson urges him to remain objective instead of being led by his emotions. Speaking of his own pain then, he confesses that Sarah used to be his girlfriend. Gaining Boyd's trust with his honesty, Lawson promises to find Marie's culprit. At work the next afternoon, Lawson gets Boyd to think about a different perspective, considering how easy it would be for Marie's lover to frame Boyd as the culprit instead. They then meet Walker in the evening to discuss the case. Insisting upon every detail, Walker thinks through everything and suggests that the key found in Abigail's house could maybe fit something owned by Colin instead. Later that night, an inebriated Colin leaves the bar, only to be confronted by a stranger near his car who then proceeds to stab Colin. Early the next morning, Boyd learns about Colin's disappearance and promptly heads over to his place with the mystery key. Successfully trying the key at Colin's shed, Boyd informs Kessler and is asked to wait for backup to arrive before doing anything else. Nonetheless, Boyd enters Colin's house, and a patch of blood on the carpet urges him to head back to the shed instead. Entering it on his own, he initially spots tools of all kinds before coming across Colin on the wall. Lawson soon joins Boyd and informs him of the team having found Colin's car in the lake. They are then led to a hidden room that was discovered in his house, which holds a clear display of his plans. Details of past victims along with several future targets are found whom Colin possibly believed he was helping. When Boyd expresses his surprise at not finding anything about Marie in the plan, Lawson states that it is because she isn't Colin's victim. He explains that since Marie's attack is a complete replica of the Chicago homicides, it implies that they are dealing with two separate culprits, one of whom has now passed. Adding that finding the foreigner that Colin met would provide all the remaining answers, Lawson suggests that they begin checking at the security firm where he was employed. On the website of the firm, Lawson sees a photograph of Colin with Walker at a convention in London. When Walker calls just then, Lawson tells him about Colin's demise. After confirming that Walker is coming over, Lawson sends Boyd the convention's photograph and mentions meeting Walker soon. Recognizing that Walker is the foreigner that Colin met in London, Boyd urgently leaves for Lawson's hotel. He calls Kessler on his way to inform her about the danger, even as Walker enters Lawson's room to find his laptop still open to the photograph on the website. He tries to defend himself by saying that he deals with several security firms and hence could not remember having met Colin. Still en route, Boyd calls Lawson to warn him about Walker, causing him to silently arm himself. Showing Walker the jewelry souvenirs from their Chicago case, Lawson mentions knowing about Walker gifting the necklace to Sarah, Aiming his gun at Walker, Lawson accuses him of stealing Sarah from him. Revealing his truth to a grief-stricken Walker, Lawson admits to having disposed of Sarah's torso to avoid being caught for being jealous of her affair in the same way as he had hinted to Boyd before. When asked about the cross-formation of the limbs, Lawson says that he didn't mean to arrange them in any particular way, and that it just happened to be the way they remained. Accepting his crimes, he assures Walker that the 4 other victims were hardly innocent, and proceeds to mention their link to the case by proving that his targets were not as random as previously believed. He says one of them was the receptionist of the hotel where Walker checked in with Sarah. Another was a clerk at the jewelry store from where Walker bought the necklace for Sarah. One was the florist from whom Walker bought flowers for Sarah, and the last was the waiter from the restaurant where they had a meal together. Coming to terms with the truth, Walker mentions having been guilty all this time for not being able to deliver justice and lunges at Lawson but gets shot in the process. When Boyd finally arrives, still believing that Walker is the culprit, Lawson tries to convince him to end Walker to bring Sarah and Marie to justice. Boyd keeps his gun aimed at Walker while Lawson discreetly escapes. Walker's confession of being in love gets Boyd's attention just before Walker breathes his last. After calling for medical help, Boyd observes the jewelry souvenirs and goes through Lawson's things. He finally recognizes his blunder when he sees Lawson's fake passports and his plans to visit Ireland. He immediately leaves the hotel to follow him out and continues to chase him down the highway. Informing Kessler of his location, he reports Lawson's truth even as he leaves the highway. Boyd follows Lawson down a much smaller road before turning into the woods. Eventually, he comes across Lawson, who is waiting to shoot at him. Despite his car being hit by multiple shots from Lawson, Boyd gains consciousness a while later. Hearing Lawson whistling in the woods, Boyd seeks him out. Recognizing Lawson as not being the helpful colleague he pretended to be, Boyd confronts him about Marie's fate. Lawson simply replies that his actions have freed Boyd since there was no forgiving Marie after being unfaithful. Confident since he hasn't been caught for 6 years, Lawson insists that nothing can stop him from continuing down his chosen path. Approaching Boyd soon after, he demands for his gun and proceeds to shoot his phone so he cannot call for help. As Lawson leaves, Boyd promises that he will certainly hunt him down. In Ireland the next day, Lawson is pulled in for a seemingly normal customs check right off the ferry while orchestrated by Boyd. However, it turns out to be a different person, despite the Farah's manifest mentioning Lawson's name. An already enraged Boyd then learns from Kessler that the case has been transferred to Interpol, but he remains determined to be the one to catch him for what he did to Marie. Elsewhere, Lawson is seen enjoying a drink by himself before driving away, free as ever. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this recap, drop a like and always see you on the next one.